Today, we're going to dig into a really powerful and honestly a largely forgotten economic principle that's been hiding in plain sight. Let's explore the forgotten Jubilee.
Okay, so let's kick things off with a phrase we've all heard, right? Judeo-Christian values. I mean, it gets thrown around constantly in politics and culture, almost like it's the bedrock for our entire society. But what happens if we actually, put that claim to the test? Because what if I told you that one of the most important economic laws from that very tradition has been, actively ignored, even fought against for thousands of years? It's a question that kind of shakes the whole foundation of that claim.
And this takes us right into a massive contradiction that sits at the very heart of our modern economic systems.
And this slide just lays it all out, doesn't it? On one hand, you've got the claimed value system, the Judeo-Christian ethics, but on the other hand, you have an economic reality, a praxis that seems to completely reject one of its most radical and foundational laws.
The source material really doesn't pull any punches here. It points out that the idea of periodically hitting a reset button on property rights is so alien to our current way of thinking that it's often met with fierce, even violent opposition. It creates this huge disconnect with the very values being claimed.
So to really understand this, we need to go back to the source. Let's take a look at what the biblical texts actually call God's economic rhythm.
So this concept is called the Jubilee, and it's essentially a divine law that commands a complete hard reset of the entire economy every 50 years. I mean, just think about that for a second. It was designed as this powerful built-in mechanism to counteract the natural human tendency to just accumulate more and more and more.
So what did this hard reset actually involve? Well, it breaks down into three very specific, very concrete actions. First, all land was returned to its original family owners. Second, all debts were completely wiped clean, forgiving. And third, all indentured servants or slaves were set free. It was a total economic release.
And if you're wondering, how on earth could a law this radical be justified? Well, it all comes down to this one verse from Leviticus. God basically declares ultimate ownership of the land, period.
The implication of this is it's profound. It completely reframes our entire relationship with property. According to this worldview, we aren't permanent sovereigns. We're not kings of our own little castles. We're temporary stewards, more like tenants, really. And that means property rights are conditional. They're not absolute.
Okay, so what happened when this divine rhythm was ignored? As you can imagine, the historical texts are full of some pretty serious prophetic warnings about the consequences. This timeline really puts the scale of it all into perspective. The law is given way back around 1400 BCE. Fast forward 800 years, and you've got the prophet Jeremiah already warning Israel for ignoring it. Then Jesus himself shows up and proclaims the spirit of Jubilee, and since his time, over 40 of these 50-year cycles have just passed by. That's over 40 missed resets.
The prophet Jeremiah's warning was particularly sharp. See, the people had freed their slaves, but then they immediately turned around and re-enslaved them. God's response, according to the text, was this deeply ironic proclamation of freedom, not the freedom of Jubilee, but the freedom to face destruction, the exact opposite.
And this is how later biblical writers made sense of the devastating Babylonian exile. They saw it as the land itself forcibly taking the rest it had been denied for centuries. It's this stark theological cause and effect. You ignore this fundamental economic law, and it leads to total societal collapse.
Now let's see how this ancient concept feeds directly into the ministry of Jesus, because he picks it up and centers it in a new and incredibly powerful way.
In his very first public sermon, like his big debut, Jesus reads this passage from the prophet Isaiah. And this wasn't just him reading some nice poetry. This was an explicit political and economic declaration. The phrases, liberty to the captives and the year of the Lord's favor, are direct, unmistakable Jubilee language. He was basically announcing that it had arrived.
Jesus frames the core human choice in these stark economic terms. You cannot serve two masters. On one side, you have God, whose system is all about release, restorative justice, what the text calls mishpat, and relationship. On the other side is Mammon, which is basically wealth personified as a rival god, whose system is driven by accumulation, leverage, and power.
And he did not mince words about unjust systems. He compared them to diseased trees that produce bad fruit. The solution wasn't just to trim a few branches or try to make the bad fruit look better. Nope, the entire system, the tree itself, had to be cut down at the root.
So this brings this entire ancient narrative crashing right into our world today, forcing us to confront a very modern choice between two totally opposing worldviews.
The Jubilee worldview is built on a foundational assumption of God's sufficiency and abundance. In total contrast, modern economics is almost entirely built on the assumption of scarcity, treating it like it's a fundamental, unchangeable law of the universe.
And this is why, according to the sources, modern proposals for soft resets, like the ones from thinkers like Ray Dalio, are seen as lukewarm, just not enough. They're basically attempts to manage a crisis from within the logic of accumulation, instead of challenging that logic in the first place.
Which brings us back to this number, 40. Plus, that is how many Jubilees have been missed just since the time of Jesus. Just let that sink in for a second. That's 2,000 years of compounding accumulation, 2,000 years of debt and inequality just building on itself, when the entire system was designed to have a release valve every 50 years.
So what are the big takeaways here? First, Jubilee isn't some weird fringe idea. It's a core economic law in this tradition. Second, the entire conflict really just boils down to one thing: release versus accumulation. Third, this shows us that scarcity, the very bedrock of modern economics, isn't a hard fact. It's a worldview. And all of that means that choosing an economic system isn't just a practical decision. It's a profoundly moral and spiritual act.
And so this explainer leaves us with the same massive choice presented in the book of Deuteronomy. It reframes our whole economic debate not as left versus right, but as this fundamental decision between two opposing paths, one that leads to release and life, and one that leads to endless accumulation and ultimately collapse. The choice, it seems, is ours.